There is a house in America that appears in photographs, personal letters, and local memory, but not in government files. No deed, no census record, no tax history. Officially, it never existed. Yet people lived there, children were raised there, and one day the house went silent. No police report, no relocation notice, no explanation. Years later, buried beneath its foundation, evidence surfaced that should have rewritten the record, if the record had allowed it. This isn't a ghost story, it's something worse. A real place erased so completely that history itself pretends it was never there. History teaches us to trust records, maps, deeds, census pages, official stamps. We're told that if something mattered, it was documented. If it existed, it was recorded. But that belief depends on one fragile assumption, that every record was created to preserve the truth. In reality, some were designed to control it. Tonight's story is not about a forgotten ruin or a legend passed down through rumor. It's about a real house that stood on American soil and then vanished, not through fire or decay, but through deliberate omission. Government files that should name it remain silent. Pages that should explain it are blank. This is the story of how an ordinary home became an inconvenience and how erasing ink proved easier than moving people. Because when history becomes uncomfortable, it isn't always rewritten. Sometimes it's simply removed. In the early years of the 1930s, eastern Tennessee existed in a quiet pocket of America that progress seemed to bypass. The Great Depression had slowed everything to a crawl, but in this region, life had already been moving slowly long before the stock market collapsed. Dirt roads cut through rolling hills, farmhouses were spaced far apart, each one a small island of survival surrounded by fields, trees, and silence. At the edge of one such road stood the house. It wasn't large, it wasn't ornate, it wasn't old enough to be historic or grand enough to be admired. A two-story wooden farmhouse with a shallow porch and a tin roof dulled by years of rain, it blended perfectly into the landscape. White paint peeled from the siding in thin strips. The windows were narrow, practical, built for light rather than beauty. A hand-dug well sat a few yards from the porch, capped with a weathered wooden cover. To passers-by, few as they were, the house registered as ordinary, and that ordinariness mattered. It was the kind of place no one photographed intentionally. No postcards featured it, no newspapers mentioned it. It didn't host gatherings or produce crops worth reporting. It simply existed, doing what thousands of rural homes did at the time, sheltering a family season after season, unnoticed by the wider world. The land around it was modest but workable. A small vegetable plot stretched behind the house, bordered by rough fencing that had been repaired more times than replaced. The soil wasn't rich, but it was forgiving enough to grow beans, corn, and squash. Chickens were sometimes kept near the back, though never in large numbers. This was subsistence living, nothing more, nothing less. What made the house unusual was not what it was, but where it sat. It occupied a narrow strip of land between two properties that were clearly documented, taxed, and mapped. The road recognized it, neighbors recognized it, even utility paths curved around it naturally, as if it had always been there. And for all practical purposes, it had. Yet the house seemed to exist in a blind spot, visible to the eye, but invisible to authority. From the road, you could see the front door directly. It faced east, catching the early morning light. The porch boards sagged slightly in the middle, worn down by years of boots and bare feet. A simple wooden railing framed the steps. Nothing about it suggested secrecy. Nothing about it suggested danger. And yet, something about the house resisted permanence. There were no boundary markers driven deep into the ground, no stone walls, no iron gates. The fence posts were shallow, as if no one expected them to last. Even the house itself appeared lightly anchored to the land, resting more than rooted. Locals later said it felt temporary, though no one could explain why. During the day, the house behaved like any other. Smoke rose from the chimney in winter. Laundry appeared on the line during warmer months. At night, a single lamp glowed in the upstairs window, proof of life, proof of presence. But there was an absence too, subtle but persistent. No mail carrier was ever seen stopping there. No delivery wagons, no official visits. The house did not attract the normal rhythms of paperwork and bureaucracy that followed most properties, even rural ones, as if the systems that tracked land ownership and residency simply skipped over it. This wasn't immediately suspicious. In the 1930s, rural America was full of gaps and inconsistencies. Records were handwritten, clerks made mistakes, fires destroyed courthouses, entire families slipped through the cracks of documentation. But this house wasn't missing from one record. It was missing from all of them. What makes that fact unsettling is not just the absence itself, but its precision. The surrounding properties were meticulously accounted for. Survey lines were clear, tax rolls were intact. The omission was clean, too clean to be random. Standing there, the house gave no indication of the role it would later play in unanswered questions. It didn't look like a place where history would fracture. It looked like a place meant to be forgotten. And perhaps that was the point. Because the easiest things to erase are not the remarkable ones, but the ordinary ones. The houses no one writes about, the families no one photographs, the places that don't seem important until someone decides they're inconvenient. In the early years before the silence came, the house remained what it had always been, a quiet structure on a quiet road, occupying space without drawing attention. Present, but already slipping out of reach. If the house was ordinary in appearance, the paperwork surrounding it was anything but. Property records are designed to be dull. They exist to remove uncertainty, to translate land into lines, names, and dates that can be taxed, transferred, and defended. Especially in the early 20th century, rural counties depended on these records to maintain order. Land disputes were common, and documentation was the only protection a family had against losing what little they owned. That's what makes the absence of this house so disturbing. When researchers later examined county land books from the 1920s and 1930s, they found something unusual. The ledgers were intact. Pages yellowed with age, handwriting uneven but consistent. Surrounding properties appeared exactly where they should, complete with ownership transfers, assessed values, and tax payments logged year after year. Then, abruptly, the sequence broke. Between two recorded parcels sat a blank space. No owner listed, no acreage assigned, no notation explaining the omission. It wasn't crossed out, it wasn't labeled as disputed or unclaimed. It simply wasn't there. In map surveys from the same period, the anomaly became clearer. Hand-drawn plats outlined roads, streams, and boundaries with careful precision. Yet, where the house stood, the lines bent slightly, curving around an invisible obstacle. Surveyors acknowledged the land physically while refusing to acknowledge it administratively. This wasn't how mistakes looked. Errors left traces, corrections were messy, notes crowded margins, but this omission was clean, almost elegant, as if someone had gone out of their way to ensure nothing appeared where something clearly existed. Census records deepened the mystery. The 1930 federal census was thorough, particularly in rural areas where enumerators went door to door. Names were misspelled, ages were estimated, occupations were vague, but households were counted. Everyone had a place on the page. Everyone, except the family in the house. Neighbors on either side appeared in the census, listed in sequence, their residences mapped according to location, but the numbering skipped directly over the farmhouse. The enumerator didn't mark it as vacant, didn't note it as newly constructed, didn't explain its absence at all. It was as if the census taker never saw it, or was instructed not to record it. Tax records offered no clarity. There were no payments associated with the parcel, no delinquency notices, no seizures, not even an exemption. In a time when counties aggressively pursued unpaid taxes, such silence was unnatural. The house was not untaxed, it was unrecognized. Normally, that would suggest squatting or informal settlement, but those cases still generated disputes, complaints, or at least marginal notes. Here, there was nothing. No conflict, no resolution, no paper trail to follow. Even more troubling were the federal documents. During the late 1930s, multiple agencies began surveying land for infrastructure, defense, and development projects. These efforts produced overlapping layers of paperwork, reports, assessments, maps. In these documents, the surrounding region appeared repeatedly, but the house did not. Not as a structure, not as a residence, not as an obstacle to be moved or compensated. It wasn't classified as public land, it wasn't classified as private land. It existed in a category of its own, unacknowledged. Historians often say that absence in records can be explained by loss, fires, floods, decay. But this explanation fails here. The courthouse records were intact, nearby files survived. The gaps appeared only where the house should have been, which suggests the omission wasn't accidental, it was selective. Someone had decided acknowledging the house created more problems than ignoring it, and ignoring it required coordination between local clerks, census enumerators, and federal offices that rarely moved in perfect alignment. That level of consistency doesn't happen by chance. What's perhaps most unsettling is how easily it worked. Without records, the house had no legal existence. Without legal existence, it had no protections, no rights, no recognized occupants. If something happened there, anything at all, it would not officially matter. Paper doesn't just record reality, it defines it. And in this case, the absence of ink became a form of erasure more powerful than demolition. The house could stand, a family could live inside it, years could pass, but without documentation, none of it counted. The records didn't lose the house, they refused to acknowledge it. If the house was an enigma, the people who lived there were its heartbeat, the part that made the silence haunting. Despite being erased from maps, ledgers, and census records, the house was not empty. It was alive with the rhythms of a family, a mother preparing meals over a wood stove, a father repairing a sagging roof, children racing along the fence line and chasing chickens across the yard. To anyone who actually saw them, they were ordinary, unremarkable, yet entirely human. The family consisted of 5 members. The father, a wiry man with sun-darkened skin and hands scarred from years of manual labor, was meticulous in ways that contrasted with the randomness of their missing documentation. He kept careful journals, detailing planting schedules, the weather, and repairs around the house, scribbles in notebooks that would survive long after official records refused to. The mother, quiet yet authoritative, managed the household with a precision born of necessity. The 3 children, a girl and 2 boys, were full of energy, their laughter a constant echo across the fields, leaving traces of their existence only in local memory. Church records provide the first glimpse of them, albeit fleeting. Attendance logs show the family appearing sporadically during the late 1920s. The mother's name is listed once for a Sunday service. The children are recorded in the confirmation registry. But that is the last official acknowledgement of their presence. After that, it is as though they were written out of existence. No marriages, no births, no deaths, nothing. The official narrative cannot accommodate them. Neighbors, interviewed decades later, recalled the family with vivid clarity, painting a picture entirely at odds with the documents. They remembered the father climbing ladders to repair shingles, the mother walking to town carrying a small basket, and the children playing hide-and-seek among the overgrown weeds. One elderly neighbor, recalling a fleeting glimpse of the family, whispered that the children sometimes ran to the nearby creek, shouting to unseen friends, their voices carrying across the hills. Those voices, ephemeral and uncaptured, were the only records that truly survived. Life in the house was ordinary, but with an undercurrent of tension. Despite the calm outward appearance, the family knew something about their existence made them vulnerable. They had no official identity in the eyes of the state. They could not claim property rights, access government services, or appear in legal matters. If an emergency struck, there was no recourse. Their anonymity was not accidental. It was enforced by the very structures that typically preserve life and property. And yet, for a time, they thrived. They hunted small game, grew vegetables, collected rainwater for drinking, and made do with what the land provided. There were birthdays celebrated quietly, meals shared with neighbors, and simple pleasures. The smell of bread baking in a wood stove, the crackle of firewood at night, the children's footsteps in the hall. The house, though absent from official records, contained everything a family might need: shelter, safety, and connection. But life in invisibility has consequences. The lack of recognition left them exposed in subtle ways. Supplies and deliveries were often inconsistent. When illnesses struck, there was no official documentation to validate claims or seek help. The children could not enroll in public schools, and any attempt to access official resources risked drawing attention to a presence the authorities seemed determined to ignore. The family was living on the margins of legality, caught between existence and non-existence. And yet, for a time, they thrived. Later neighbors told stories of the final days. One remembered seeing the family moving about less frequently, the children quieter, the parents tense, as if aware that the invisible walls around them were closing in. And then, one day, they were gone. No wagons loaded with possessions, no goodbyes whispered on the porch. One week, the house was filled with life. The next, it was silent. Windows dark, doors locked. The presence that had been so tangible, so human, evaporated overnight, leaving behind only the physical shell of the home and memories that could not be documented. It is tempting to imagine what happened in those final hours, to fill the void left by missing records with conjecture. Were they quietly removed by authorities? Did they flee out of fear? Or did the invisibility imposed upon them simply consume their future? Whatever the truth, it is undeniable that the family existed, even if no archive will ever admit it. Their lives, rich and ordinary, became a ghostly echo in the landscape of history, present in memory, but absent on paper. And that's the cruelest part. The house could vanish from the records, but the people who lived there, their laughter, their struggles, their love, cannot be fully erased. Even in absence, they leave traces that cannot be controlled, impressions in the minds of neighbors, fingerprints in buried letters, the subtle influence of ordinary lives lived against the weight of systemic omission. The family is gone from the ledgers, but not from reality. After the family disappeared, the house remained, but it was no longer alive. The windows stared blankly into the fields. The once practical porch sagged further under the weight of neglect. Grass grew through the cracks in the fence. A faint odor of decay clung to the air during rainy seasons, subtle yet unmistakable. The house, which had once been a hub of ordinary life, had become a monument to absence. What made the disappearance so unsettling was not just the suddenness of it, it was the utter lack of explanation. There were no letters left behind, no announcements, no records of relocation. One week, the house hummed with activity, the children's laughter bouncing across the hills, smoke curling from the chimney, the mother tending her vegetables, the father hammering away on the roof. The next, nothing. The silence was profound, not merely quiet, but deliberate, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Neighbors remembered the change vividly. Mrs. Harlan, who lived across the road, recalled walking past the house one spring morning. The air was heavy, almost unnatural. She had expected to see the mother's laundry swaying gently in the breeze. Instead, the line was empty, the yard still. A single bird called from a nearby tree, echoing against the quiet in a way that made her shiver. When she peered through the windows, there was no movement inside. The chairs were in place, the stove cold. The house seemed to exist solely as a structure, stripped of its inhabitants. No one reported the family missing, no authorities knocked on doors. In a time when small communities were tightly connected, news traveled fast. And yet, no one filed a complaint, no one sought explanation, no official document acknowledged the sudden absence. It was as though the house and its residents had been quietly excised from reality itself. The silence extended beyond the house. Surrounding land felt different, almost like a buffer zone, a space where the normal rhythms of rural life faltered. Animals that once grazed nearby were rarely seen. Paths that led past the property grew over with weeds. Locals walked around it with an unconscious caution, instinctively respecting the invisible boundary that now seemed to define the property. Rumors began to spread, whispered in barns, over fences, at church gatherings. Some said the family had been taken by authorities for reasons no one dared speak aloud. Others insisted they had fled, escaping something darker than mere poverty or bureaucracy. There was no evidence to support any of these claims, but the silence of records lent credence to every whispered theory. Even decades later, the silence remained. The house endured through storms, neglect, and the slow encroachment of nature. Trees grew into the walls, roots cracked the foundation, and yet the structure refused to collapse entirely. It was a hollow monument, both present and absent, tangible and ethereal. Hikers and explorers who stumbled upon it in later years described the experience as eerie, almost unnatural. There was no wind that could explain the stillness inside, no insects loud enough to fill the empty rooms. It was a place caught between being and nothingness, a liminal space where the absence of people weighed heavier than their presence ever could. Historians examining the area noted the lack of records with increasing unease. Land books, tax ledgers, and federal surveys had no mention of the family, and the property itself appeared only as an unclaimed, undefined rectangle in archival maps. It was a gap in continuity so perfect that it suggested intention. Mistakes leave traces, scribbles, marginalia, notes explaining anomalies, but this blankness was deliberate. Every line avoided the property. Every official eye seemed to look elsewhere. The house existed in reality, but outside of reality's acknowledgement. In the quiet of the abandoned farmhouse, one can almost imagine echoes of life lingering. A child's laughter bouncing off unseen walls, a mother's voice calling from the kitchen, a father hammering in rhythm to his own thoughts. These are traces that no government file can erase. Even in silence, life leaves marks. Even in erasure, reality asserts itself. The absence of documentation transformed the house into a paradox. It was undeniable, yet invisible, physical, yet erased, ordinary, yet profoundly unsettling. The silence wasn't passive, it was active. It spoke to something larger than the family or the house, a statement about control, about the fragility of existence when your presence is not recorded, and about how easily ordinary lives can vanish when the ink dries elsewhere. And in that silence, the house waited, patiently, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to ask questions the records refused to answer, waiting to prove that erasure does not equal absence, and that even the quietest lives leave an indelible mark on history. Decades after the house fell silent, the surrounding land remained largely untouched. Nature had reclaimed much of it. Tall grass swayed over broken fence lines, and vines clung to walls that had begun to buckle under time. The structure itself seemed to hold its ground stubbornly, defying collapse, a physical remnant of a family and a history that officially never existed. For years, passers-by ignored it, assuming it was simply another abandoned farmhouse swallowed by the hills. It was not until the 1970s that the house finally revealed one of its long-hidden secrets. A utility crew, contracted to lay underground electrical and water lines, arrived to survey the area. The workers were unaware of the property's dark history. They treated it as just another obstacle in the rural landscape. But as they dug near the foundation, their shovels struck something unusual. A small, rusted metal box buried just beneath the floorboards of what had once been the living room. The box was heavy, wedged into a shallow pit. Its lid was corroded, but the outline of hinges and a simple lock remained visible. When they pried it open, the contents were immediately puzzling. Inside were documents, letters, and personal papers, surprisingly well preserved given their years underground. A yellowed, handwritten birth certificate listed the children's names and dates of birth, names that did not appear in any official government registry. Torn pages from a journal revealed the father's meticulous notes on crop rotations, repairs, and the weather. A small folded map detailed property lines and landmarks drawn with care and precision. Yet cross-referenced against county and federal archives, these names and parcels appeared nowhere else. The discovery was astonishing. Here was tangible evidence of lives that bureaucratic systems had erased. It was as if reality itself had been defied. A family had lived and thrived, and yet in all the official records, they never existed. The documents told stories of ordinary life, birthdays, chores, minor injuries, letters sent to friends and relatives, but they also revealed a subtle anxiety, a consciousness of invisibility. The father's notes occasionally hinted at tension, vague fears about outside authority, as if he understood that their existence was fragile, not because of the land or neighbors, but because of the paper that should have documented them. Historians and local researchers who later examined the contents were struck by the precision of the omission. The family's handwriting, the meticulous drawings of fences and gardens, the clear documentation of births and deaths were all verifiable in terms of internal consistency, but they had been invisible to the outside world. No deeds recorded, no census entries, no tax filings. The box, buried beneath the floorboards, had preserved a truth that every official ledger denied. The discovery also raised questions that could not easily be answered. Why was the box buried at all? Was it a precaution for loss, decay, or theft? Or was it an attempt to ensure that if their existence were ever questioned, some proof would survive, proof outside the reach of authorities who had systematically ignored them? The placement beneath the foundation, directly under the living room where the family had gathered for meals and conversation, suggested intentionality. It was not lost by accident, it was hidden deliberately. Even after the documents surfaced, the story remained incomplete. County clerks and federal archivists could offer no explanation for the missing entries. Maps and ledgers from the period still bore the same blank rectangle where the property should have been. Oral histories offered fragments. Neighbors recalled children playing and parents tending gardens, but no official record validated these memories. The physical evidence had been found, yet the broader system still denied the family's existence. The discovery transformed the house from a silent, neglected structure into a site of intrigue and unanswered questions. It proved that erasure in the archives was not a myth. It proved that ordinary lives could vanish not from accident, but from deliberate omission. And it proved that even in the absence of recognition, reality leaves traces that refuse to be buried entirely. For those who examined the box, the experience was haunting. There was a sense of intimacy, of being allowed to peer into lives that were never meant to be visible, and a corresponding discomfort that came with knowing the system that should have preserved them actively refused to do so. Every note, every map, every letter reinforced the incomprehensible truth. The house, the family, the life they built, it had existed in full, while the world's records insisted otherwise. The discovery was not a resolution, it was a revelation. A piece of hidden history unearthed, yes, but also a reminder of how fragile our understanding of the past can be, how easily ordinary lives can be made invisible, and how the truth sometimes survives only because it was intentionally concealed.
The discovery of the buried box brought more questions than answers. Who had hidden it? Why had this family and their house been systematically erased from records? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if the government or someone acting on its behalf had intentionally removed them from official acknowledgement, what else might have been covered up in plain sight? To understand the magnitude of the situation, it's necessary to consider the context. In the late 1930s, the United States was emerging from the Great Depression, preparing for the possibility of war overseas and quietly expanding federal oversight into previously overlooked regions. Infrastructure projects, land acquisitions, and classified programs were undertaken with minimal public documentation. Rural counties were particularly susceptible to omissions, delays, and selective reporting. But what happened with this house exceeded mere bureaucratic inefficiency. It suggested intentional action. The family's absence from all property and census records was far too precise to be accidental. Surrounding parcels were meticulously recorded, taxes were paid, ownerships clearly documented. The rectangle where the house stood was clean, a deliberate blank. It was almost as if someone had drawn a line around the property in reality while erasing it in history. The buried box added weight to this suspicion. Every document it contained verified lives that the government files refused to acknowledge. But how could such a discrepancy persist without higher-level orchestration? Archival research revealed a pattern. During the same years, several rural areas across multiple states had properties with missing or altered records. Some of these omissions corresponded with federally funded projects, airfields, training grounds, industrial facilities built under programs that were classified at the time. Families who occupied land in proximity to these projects sometimes vanished from official documentation, their deeds unrecorded, their existence reduced to anecdotal memory. The house in eastern Tennessee fit this pattern uncannily. Local oral histories hinted at more. Neighbors recalled uniformed men arriving at odd hours, measuring boundaries and issuing quiet warnings. Children were seen playing while strangers took notes, photographed structures, and marked fences. One elderly resident remembered overhearing a discussion about relocating inconvenient families, a phrase never explained but never denied. Though these accounts were fragmentary and anecdotal, they aligned with the absence in records and the existence of the hidden box. A cover-up, deliberate and coordinated, seemed plausible. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just an isolated clerical error. It was an example of how ordinary lives could be erased quietly, legally, or at least without challenge. Without deeds, census entries, or tax filings, the family's legal existence was null. They could not claim property rights, they could not defend themselves against eviction or seizure. Even their identities were vulnerable. Without official acknowledgement, births, deaths, and marriages were invisible. The state did not need to act violently, it only needed to ignore. The buried box became the family's final defiance. By hiding their records beneath the foundation, they created a time capsule, a proof outside the reach of official bureaucracy. It was subtle but effective. For decades, the truth slept in metal and paper, waiting for someone to uncover it. It was a private rebellion against erasure, evidence that could not be denied entirely. Yet even with the box unearthed, the larger system remained unchanged. Land registries still contained the blank rectangle, census records remained untouched, tax documents offered no acknowledgement. The cover-up had succeeded in removing them from the world that mattered most, the world of official recognition. The discovery only proved that erasure could be challenged, it did not reverse it. The family's absence remained codified in the nation's bureaucratic memory. This is the cruel paradox of the house. While it existed physically and socially for years, the systems meant to document life treated it as irrelevant. Every ledger, every map, every federal report had a role in maintaining invisibility. The cover-up was both simple and sophisticated. Ordinary lives quietly erased, contained within a blank rectangle on paper, but living, breathing, and documented elsewhere, hidden in secrecy, waiting to be found. And perhaps that is the true lesson of the house. History is not always what the records say it is. Erasure can be deliberate, and the absence of evidence is not always an accident. Ordinary lives can be removed from history, leaving only fragments, whispers, and buried boxes to remind us that even erasure leaves traces. The house, the family, the forgotten records, they were never gone. They were hidden, waiting for someone patient enough to notice, someone willing to dig beneath the surface of paper, bureaucracy, and silence. Standing before the house today, it is difficult to reconcile what is visible with what is known. The structure itself is fragile, partially collapsed, overrun by weeds and vines. The windows, once portals for light and life, are now dark, cracked, and empty. The roof sags under its own weight, and the wooden siding is weathered almost to the point of disappearance. Yet, despite its decay, the house retains an undeniable presence. It occupies space, casts shadows, and whispers of lives that official records have erased. For anyone who visits, it is impossible not to sense that it once held ordinary moments, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the laughter of children, moments that leave traces stronger than ink on paper. History often assumes permanence through documentation. We trust ledgers, maps, censuses, and deeds to tell the truth. But the house demonstrates that records are not infallible. They are instruments wielded by those in power to validate or ignore existence. In this case, the family lived, grew, and interacted with the world, yet the bureaucracy rendered them invisible. Official files refused to mention them, leaving only fragmentary proof, letters, a birth certificate, a hand-drawn survey, and memories preserved by neighbors who would not forget what the archives erased. The house, the land, and the family together form a paradox, present and absent simultaneously, real yet officially unreal, tangible yet unacknowledged. The discovery of the buried box decades later did not restore their existence. It merely proved that their lives had been lived. The documents contained within were personal, intimate, and meticulously recorded, evidence of ordinary survival against extraordinary erasure. Every journal entry, every letter, every carefully drawn map was a silent protest against invisibility. In hiding their story beneath the very foundation of their home, the family ensured that the truth could endure without requiring validation from the institutions that had omitted them. Their act of preservation was quiet, almost invisible, yet infinitely more resilient than the official records that ignored them. Reflecting on this, one cannot help but recognize the fragility of memory and the power of omission. History is rarely neutral. It is curated by those who write it, record it, and archive it. Governments, institutions, and bureaucracies decide what is important, what is legitimate, and what is worth acknowledging. In doing so, they wield enormous influence over which lives are remembered and which are consigned to silence. The house exemplifies the consequences of such decisions. Lives that were ordinary, unremarkable, and unprotected were rendered non-existent simply because the machinery of record-keeping chose to overlook them. And yet, the story of the house also illustrates resilience. Physical structures can decay, but evidence hidden with care can survive decades of neglect. Memories persist in neighbors' recollections. Human lives leave traces beyond bureaucratic acknowledgement. Erasure is powerful, but it is not absolute. Even when official recognition fails, reality persists. The house, the buried box, and the fragments of memory together testify to a truth the records refuse to record: that ordinary lives matter and that they can endure even in the face of systemic invisibility. The lesson is unsettling. It is not only about a single house or a single family. It is about the countless lives that might have been omitted from official history, the voices that went unrecorded, and the stories that were buried intentionally or by neglect. It challenges our understanding of the past and forces us to question what is absent from the archives we trust. What histories are hidden behind blank pages, missing ledgers, and erased names? How many ordinary families like the one in eastern Tennessee existed in parallel with official records only to be written out silently? In the end, the house and its story remain a haunting reminder. History is not simply what is recorded, it is also what is deliberately forgotten. And sometimes the most profound truths are hidden in the silences between the lines, in the gaps left where the ink refuses to fall. The house is gone from the records, but not from reality. The family is gone from the official narrative, but not from memory. Their lives, their struggles, and their quiet acts of defiance endure. And for anyone willing to look closely, to question, to notice, the traces they left behind are unmistakable. In the silent testimony of abandoned structures, buried documents, and unrecorded lives, we are reminded that some histories are not lost, they are hidden. And sometimes finding them requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to see what others have chosen to ignore. Some histories aren't lost, they're hidden. If this story made you question what's missing from the history books, don't stop here. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more forgotten, erased, and hidden stories from America's past. The truths you won't find in textbooks are waiting, if you're brave enough to look.